Imagine standing in the Great Rift Valley 300,000 years ago. The air is warm and heavy, the kind that clings to your skin. Acacia trees punctuate the horizon, but they don't form one continuous forest. Instead, the landscape is a patchwork. Woodland here, open grassland there, a lake shimmering in the distance, volcanic ridges rising like dark scars. Beneath your feet, the ground is restless. This land is literally being pulled apart, a continent cracking open into valleys and highlands, shaping rainfall, redirecting rivers, creating microclimates pressed side by side. In one valley, life thrives. Over the next ridge, the world is dry. The point isn't scenery. The point is pressure. A world like this doesn't reward creatures that are perfect at one thing. It rewards creatures that can switch strategies without breaking. And somewhere in this dynamic, fragmented, changing Africa, this continent of diversity and instability, balanced with refuge, our species begins to take form. Homo sapiens, not as a sudden miracle, not as a single birth moment, but as a slow convergence of anatomy and mind that becomes recognizable only in hindsight. But here's the question that matters, the one that should stick in your thoughts even as you drift towards sleep. Why here? Why Africa? Why not Asia, where higher primates may have first appeared? Why not Europe, where forests once stretched farther north? Why not some other continent with rivers, animals and trees? The raw ingredients existed elsewhere. Primates evolved across the planet. At different times, apes lived in Europe and Asia, yet every living human, every language, every culture, every city, every myth, every tool, every scientific equation traces back to one origin story: Africa. That isn't poetry, it's genetic fact. The deeper you go into human DNA, the more unmistakable it becomes. African populations hold the greatest human genetic diversity on Earth. The further you travel away from Africa, the more that diversity narrows, like a story copied again and again from an original manuscript until only a subset remains. The rest of the world is a branch. Africa is the trunk. So what made Africa different? The answer is not one simple cause. Evolution rarely offers clean explanations. It is messy, contingent, full of dead ends. But Africa had a combination of forces that aligned again and again over deep time, and those forces shaped a lineage toward adaptability, social intelligence, and eventually culture. Start with geography. Africa sits across the equator, and that matters because as the planet cooled over millions of years, and as ice ages intensified, climates at higher latitudes became harsh and seasonal. Forests in Europe and much of Asia expanded and collapsed like breathing lungs. Lush during warm phases, then retreating during cold phases. For primates adapted to stable tropical habitats, strong seasonality is dangerous. When fruit disappears for months, when cold nights become common, when food cycles hard, populations shrink, fragment, and often vanish. Africa, buffered by its equatorial position, remained more consistently habitable across long spans of time. Not stable, never stable, but survivable. And survivable means continuity, and continuity is what evolution needs. You can't evolve if every experiment ends in extinction. Africa repeatedly provided refuge zones, pockets where populations could persist through bad centuries and then expand when conditions improved. That alone makes it an evolutionary engine, because persistence allows variation to accumulate, and variation is the raw material of change. But Africa didn't just preserve life, it challenged it in a special way. The continent is enormous, and its environments are extraordinarily diverse. Rainforests, savannas, coastlines, mountains, deserts, river systems, and in the east, one of the most dramatic geological features on Earth, the East African Rift. Over millions of years, tectonic forces have been pulling this region apart, forming valleys and volcanic highlands, lifting mountain ranges and dropping basins, creating lakes that appear and vanish, reshaping local climates. Mountains force rain to fall on one side and leave the other dry, producing sharp ecological contrasts over short distances. This creates microclimates, and microclimates create evolutionary laboratories. Neighboring populations can become partially isolated, adapting to slightly different conditions, developing different survival strategies, then reconnecting when climates shift, exchanging genes and behaviors. It's like evolution running multiple experiments in parallel, then occasionally merging the best results. That pattern, separation and reconnection, matters more than it sounds. Too much isolation and populations split into separate species that can't share innovations. Too little isolation and evolution can stagnate because everything stays uniform. Africa, especially rift-influenced regions, often sat in the sweet spot. Enough fragmentation to generate diversity, enough connection to spread it. Then there's the environment itself. As climates shifted and forests broke into mosaics, patches of trees separated by open ground, life changed. In a continuous forest, the best strategy is simple. Be a specialist at trees. But in a mosaic world, the rules reward versatility. Sometimes the food is in the canopy, sometimes it's on the ground, sometimes you must travel between patches, sometimes predators are easier to spot at a distance, sometimes carrying matters, sometimes heat management matters. In a mosaic landscape, creatures that can do multiple things reasonably well often outcompete those that do one thing perfectly. This is where the story begins to lean toward the trait that sets our lineage apart before anything else. Upright walking. Bipedalism didn't appear overnight. It wasn't one brave ape standing tall and instantly changing history. It was a long experiment, a gradual shift in posture and movement, shaped by many overlapping advantages. Walking upright over distances can be more energy efficient than knuckle walking. Standing tall reduces the body surface exposed to harsh overhead sun, improving heat regulation. Being upright makes it easier to see over grass, to watch predators, to scan for resources. Most importantly, bipedalism frees the hands, and once hands are free, everything changes. You can carry food, you can carry infants, you can transport tools, you can bring resources back to safer places instead of eating them where you found them. And that begins a feedback loop. Free hands encourage tool use. Tool use rewards better coordination and planning. Planning rewards larger brains. Larger brains enable more complex tools and social strategies. The body and mind begin evolving together, pulling each other forward. And this experiment took hold in Africa because Africa offered the right combination of pressures and persistence. Elsewhere, apes existed, but environments often pushed them into extinction or kept them locked in different evolutionary paths. Europe and much of Asia became increasingly seasonal and harsh at critical times. Populations were often smaller and more isolated, less able to maintain the long, slow refinement required for something as radical as a new locomotion strategy. Africa repeatedly kept populations in play, repeatedly forced them to adapt, and repeatedly allowed those adaptations to spread. That's the core pattern. Africa didn't choose us. Africa didn't intend to produce humans. But Africa produced the conditions where a lineage could keep responding to change without being erased. That is why, when you look at deep time, Africa isn't just a location. It's a process. It's a system that generates adaptability, and adaptability, more than strength or speed, is the trait that eventually becomes human intelligence. But to see the full shape of this, you have to go back further than 300,000 years. Back beyond early humans, back beyond apes, back beyond monkeys, to the moment when the world was reset. 66 million years ago, a 6-mile-wide asteroid hit the Yucatan Peninsula with unimaginable force. Firestorms swept continents. Dust and aerosols blotted out the sun. Food chains collapsed. Roughly 3/4 of all species vanished, including the non-avian dinosaurs. The planet entered a long aftermath, and in that broken world, small mammals survived by being flexible, hiding, eating whatever they could, reproducing quickly. In the recovering forests, Some of these mammals adapted to life in the trees. Trees are evolution's puzzle box. Three-dimensional movement, unstable surfaces, fruit that appears in scattered places, predators from above and below. To live there, depth perception matters. Hands matter, coordination matters, brains matter. Over millions of years, primates emerged with forward-facing eyes, grasping hands, nails instead of claws, and growing cognitive capacity. But here comes the twist. The earliest higher primates, the anthropoids, the group that would eventually give rise to monkeys, apes, and humans, seem to appear first in parts of Asia. Fossils suggest that Asia may have been the starting point for that branch. And then those primates reached Africa through shifting land bridges as the Tethys Sea shrank and continents rearranged. What happened next may be the most important filtering event in our story. Asia cooled, became more seasonal, and many of those early lineages faded. Africa, buffered by equatorial stability and filled with diverse habitats, became the refuge where primates could persist and diversify. It is one of evolution's recurring themes. The place where a lineage survives becomes the place where it innovates. From that survival, African primates diversified into Old World monkeys and, later, apes. And as apes evolved, Africa stayed central because it remained both habitable and challenging, never allowing complete comfort, never allowing complete collapse, always pushing, always reshaping. So by the time you return to that image of the Rift Valley 300,000 years ago, you can see the deeper setup. You're not standing in the birthplace of humans as a single event. You're standing in the latest stage of a long continental experiment. An experiment that favored creatures who could handle variability, cooperate socially, remember, learn, and transmit knowledge. Those traits don't show up all at once. They accumulate, they deepen. They begin as simple behavioral flexibility and grow into something else, culture. And once culture becomes strong, once knowledge can outpace genetic adaptation, the evolutionary story changes forever. But at 300,000 years ago, we are still at the threshold. The body plan is becoming modern. The brain is nearing its current range. The ecological pressures that forged flexibility and social intelligence have been operating for millions of years. In Africa's valleys and coasts, in its shifting forests and expanding grasslands, a species appears that is not stronger than every other animal, not faster, not better armed by nature, but capable of compensating for all of that with invention. Homo sapiens is born out of a continent that taught a lineage the most important survival skill on Earth, the ability to adapt without waiting for the body to change. And that is why Africa is not just where we came from. It is why we became the kind of species that could leave, spread, and transform the planet. That is the first part of the story. The stage is set. A world reset by catastrophe. Primates rising in the trees. Higher primates crossing into Africa. Climates cooling elsewhere. Africa preserving diversity. The rift creating microclimates and evolutionary laboratories, and a mosaic landscape rewarding versatility over specialization. In the next part, we follow what happens after the stage is built, the rise of bipedal hominins, the first tools, the growth of the brain, and the slow march toward modern human minds. Still in Africa, still shaped by the same deep forces, until one day a small group finally steps out of the continent and changes everything. Around 40 million years ago, long before anything that could be called human existed, the world looked very different from the one you know. The continents were familiar in outline, but unfamiliar in climate. Global temperatures were higher. Tropical forests stretched far beyond today's equator, creeping north and south into regions that are now temperate or even cold. In this warm green world, primates were no longer rare tree-dwelling experiments. They were diversifying, spreading, testing different ways of living among the branches. And here is where the story takes a turn that feels almost backward when you first hear it. The lineage that would eventually lead to humans did not begin its journey toward humanity in Africa, at least not at first. Fossil evidence suggests that the earliest higher primates the anthropoids, appeared in parts of Asia. These were not humans, not apes as you imagine them today, but small-bodied creatures with more advanced skulls, more complex teeth, and brains that were beginning to move beyond the primate baseline. They lived in Asian forests that were warm, lush, and stable enough to support fruit-eating, social animals. In other words, the conditions that had once made trees such a powerful evolutionary engine were present far beyond Africa. At this stage, there was nothing inevitable about Africa becoming the center of the human story. Asia had primates. Europe had forests. The pieces seemed widely distributed. But evolution is not just about where life appears. It is about where life can persist through change. And change was coming. The planet does not stay warm forever. After the long greenhouse phases of the early Cenozoic, Earth began a gradual cooling trend. It was not sudden. It unfolded over millions of years, but its effects were profound. As temperatures dropped, climate belts shifted. Tropical forests retreated toward the equator. Regions that had once been warm and stable became seasonal, then increasingly harsh. Winters grew colder. Food availability fluctuated. For animals adapted to year-round abundance, this was a slow-moving crisis. In Asia and Europe, many primate lineages faced a problem they were poorly equipped to solve. Their environments were no longer predictable. Fruit became seasonal. Cold periods became longer. Forests fragmented in ways that did not always leave nearby refuges. Populations shrank. Some adapted by changing diets or behaviors. Many did not. Extinction is rarely dramatic. It is often quiet. A population dwindles. Birth rates fall below death rates. A drought hits at the wrong time. A cold snap lasts a little longer than usual. And suddenly, a lineage that had persisted for millions of years is gone. Meanwhile, Africa experienced the same global cooling, but it experienced it differently. Because Africa sits across the equator, it remained warmer on average than higher latitudes. Even as global temperatures dropped, large portions of the continent stayed within a survivable range for tropical and subtropical life. This did not mean Africa was stable. Far from it. Rainfall patterns shifted. Forests expanded and contracted. Grasslands spread in some regions and retreated in others. But crucially, Africa often retained habitable zones when other regions became ecological dead ends. This made Africa a refuge. And refuge is not just a place where species hide, it is a place where evolution continues. When anthropoids reached Africa, likely through temporary land connections as seas rose and fell, they entered a continent that could support them through climatic uncertainty. Their Asian relatives did not all have that luxury. Over time, the Asian anthropoid lineages disappeared, while the African ones survived and diversified. This is a filtering process, not a triumph. Africa did not produce better primates at this stage. It simply allowed primates to keep existing while others vanished. And existence, given enough time, becomes opportunity. As millions of years passed, African anthropoids radiated into different forms. Some became what we recognize as Old World monkeys. Others followed a different path, one that would eventually give rise to apes. These early apes appeared in Africa around 25 million years ago. They were not giants. They were not knuckle walkers. They were generalized animals, capable of moving through trees and along branches, sometimes descending to the ground. They had no tails, flexible shoulders, and bodies that allowed a wide range of motion. They were, in evolutionary terms, adaptable platforms rather than specialists. And Africa, once again, proved to be the right place for such platforms to explore different solutions. The continent's size mattered here. Africa is vast, larger than the United States, China, India, and most of Europe combined. That size translates into ecological variety. Even when climate shifts affected one region, another might remain productive. Populations could retreat, survive, then expand again. Over time, this creates a pattern of persistence through fluctuation. Apes thrived in Africa, and at times spread outward again into Eurasia, when conditions allowed. Fossils show that by around 15 million years ago, apes were living across parts of Europe and Asia. At first glance, it might look like Africa was no longer central, but this expansion masked a deeper vulnerability. As global cooling continued, Eurasian environments became increasingly seasonal. Forests broke apart more completely. Grasslands expanded. Winters grew more punishing. Ape populations outside Africa faced mounting pressures. Some adapted in limited ways. Most declined. By around 8 to 10 million years ago, ape diversity outside Africa collapsed. Only a few lineages survived in Southeast Asian refugees, ancestors of modern orangutans. Africa, once again, remained the main reservoir of ape diversity. This pattern repeated itself so often that it becomes impossible to ignore. When environments become harsh and fragmented at higher latitudes, Africa retains continuity. Not comfort. Continuity. And continuity allows experiments to run longer. Around the same time, Africa itself was changing in a way that would matter enormously. The East African Rift System, which had begun forming earlier, intensified. Tectonic forces lifted highlands, dropped valleys, and reshaped drainage systems. Lakes formed where none had existed. Volcanic activity enriched soils. Mountain ranges altered rainfall patterns. Forests no longer stretched unbroken across the landscape. Instead, they fragmented into patches separated by open areas. This did not eliminate trees. It changed how trees were arranged. The result was a mosaic environment. In such an environment, no single survival strategy is universally optimal. A creature that is excellent at climbing but poor at ground travel may struggle to move between patches. A creature that is fast on open ground but helpless in trees may miss critical food sources. Versatility becomes valuable. Behavioral flexibility becomes survival. This is the context in which the ancestors of humans begin to diverge from other apes. Not because they were smarter from the start, not because they were destined for greatness, but because they were living in a landscape that rewarded certain compromises. Standing upright for short distances becomes useful. Carrying becomes useful. Seeing farther becomes useful. Heat management becomes useful. None of these advantages are decisive on their own. Together, over millions of years, they reshape bodies and behaviors. And this process unfolds in Africa because Africa sustains it. Elsewhere, ape populations are shrinking or disappearing. In Africa, they are being challenged but not erased. This is the subtle but critical distinction. Evolution does not need perfection. It needs time. Africa gave time. It gave a lineage enough generations to refine an unusual solution. Partial upright walking in a primate adapted to both trees and ground. At this stage, nothing looks inevitable. These creatures are not human. Their brains are small by our standards. Their faces are ape-like. Their lives are focused on food, predators, and reproduction. But the direction is set. Africa, through its geography and climate, has become the place where primates survive long enough to become something else. This is why the question, why Africa, has a deeper answer than simple origin. Africa was not special because it magically produced intelligence. Africa was special because it preserved the conditions under which intelligence could keep being tested, refined, and transmitted, rather than snuffed out. As you let this part of the story settle, it helps to release the idea of progress as a straight line. The ancestors of humans were not marching toward destiny. They were responding, moment by moment, generation by generation, to a continent that refused to stay the same. And in doing so, they learned a lesson that would echo through the rest of human history. Survival belongs not to the strongest or the most specialized, but to those who can adjust when the ground beneath them shifts. In the next part, we will follow this lineage more closely into the period where standing upright becomes more than an occasional strategy and begins to define a way of life. We will see how a changing African landscape nudged certain apes into walking on two legs, setting off a cascade of consequences that would eventually transform hands into tools, movement into migration, and adaptation into culture. Around 7 million years ago, the African landscape had become a place of constant negotiation between stability and change. Forests still existed, but they no longer formed endless green ceilings stretching from horizon to horizon. Instead, they were broken into patches, interrupted by open woodland, river corridors, and expanding grasslands. Rainfall came and went in unpredictable cycles. Lakes appeared, then vanished. Volcanic activity reshaped terrain and enriched soils, only to disrupt ecosystems again. For the apes living here, survival no longer meant mastering a single environment. It meant coping with transition itself. This is the setting in which one of the most important transformations in our lineage began: the gradual shift toward walking upright. Not as a sudden leap, not as a clean break from the past, but as a series of small adjustments layered on top of one another across millions of years. The earliest candidates for this transition appear right around the time when African apes and chimpanzee ancestors diverged. Fossils like Sahelanthropus from Central Africa, dated to about 7 million years ago, do not show a fully human posture. The arms are still suited for climbing, the brain is still small, but the position of the opening, where the spine meets the skull, suggests something new. The head was balanced more directly over the body, a configuration consistent with at least occasional upright posture. This alone does not mean full bipedalism, but it signals experimentation. The body was beginning to explore a different relationship with gravity. 1 million years later, other species reinforce this pattern. Aurorin from Kenya shows thigh bones with internal structures adapted to bearing weight vertically. Ardipithecus, living around 4.4 million years ago, reveals a mosaic anatomy that is especially telling. Its feet could still grasp branches, yet its pelvis shows features that support upright walking. This creature was not half human and half ape in some vague sense. It was fully adapted to a specific African environment where both climbing and walking mattered. Ardipithecus lived in woodland, not open savanna. This is important because it challenges the old idea that humans stood up simply because forests disappeared. Instead, upright walking began while trees were still present, as part of a strategy for moving efficiently between them. The body was adapting to fragmentation, not total openness. Over time, this strategy became more refined. By around 4 million years ago, Australopithecines appeared across East and Southern Africa. These were fully bipedal apes. Their pelvises were short and broad, their knees angled inward. Their feet had lost the grasping big toe and developed arches that stored and released energy with each step. They walked upright habitually, not occasionally, yet they still retained long arms and climbing ability. They were not abandoning the trees, they were expanding their options. This is the core theme of African evolution. Flexibility beats specialization. Bipedalism offered several advantages in this context. It reduced the energy cost of traveling long distances between food patches. It improved heat regulation by reducing sun exposure and increasing airflow around the body. It freed the hands to carry food, tools, or infants. It raised the head, allowing earlier detection of predators and resources. None of these advantages alone would have forced a transition. Together, over thousands of generations, they tipped the balance. Natural selection favored bodies that could handle both ground and tree life more efficiently than before. Importantly, this transition did not occur elsewhere because the same combination of pressures did not persist long enough. In Eurasia, apes faced rapid climate deterioration that eliminated forests faster and more completely. Populations shrank and vanished before such gradual experimentation could stabilize. Africa, once again, provided the runway. The environment changed, but not so fast that it erased the experiment. As Australopithecines spread and diversified, Africa hosted multiple hominin species at once. Some were more robust, adapted to chewing tough vegetation. Others were more gracile, generalist foragers. They occupied overlapping territories, competing, adapting, and sometimes going extinct. This diversity reflects a continent that did not funnel evolution down a single narrow path. Instead, it allowed many variations to coexist. But one trait united them all. They walked on two legs. This commitment changed everything that followed. Walking upright reshaped the spine, the pelvis, the legs, and the feet. These changes, in turn, altered childbirth, social structure, and life history. Infants were born more helpless. Longer childhoods emerged. Learning became more important. Social bonds strengthened. These consequences were not immediate, but they accumulated. And as hands became permanently freed from locomotion, they became increasingly central to survival. At first, hands carried food. Later, they shaped objects. Stone tools appear surprisingly early, over 3 million years ago, before the emergence of our genus. This tells us that intelligence and tool use were not sudden gifts. They grew out of bodies already committed to upright walking. Bipedalism was the foundation. Without it, the feedback loop between hands, tools, and brains would never have started. Africa's role here is not accidental. The continent's size allowed multiple hominin species to exist simultaneously. Its shifting climates repeatedly isolated populations, then brought them back together. Each cycle tested new solutions and spread successful ones. Upright walking proved resilient across these cycles. It worked in woodland. It worked in grassland. It worked near lakes and rivers. It did not lock a species into a single niche. It unlocked many. By the time Australopithecines dominated much of Africa, the human path was no longer fragile. It was established. Still, these were not humans in the modern sense. Their brains were small, their technology was simple, but the body plan that would carry humanity forward was now in place. 2 legs below, free hands above, a head balanced for scanning horizons rather than forest floors. Africa had shaped a creature that could move, adapt, and endure. In the next phase, this foundation would support something unprecedented. Brains would expand. Tools would become central rather than occasional. Fire would enter the story, and a new genus would emerge, one capable not just of surviving Africa's challenges, but of eventually leaving the continent altogether. By around 2.5 million years ago, Africa was no longer just shaping bodies. It was reshaping minds. The long experiment with upright walking had succeeded, and now its consequences began to unfold in ways that would permanently alter the trajectory of life on Earth. The hominins of this period were still small-brained compared to modern humans, but something new was happening inside their skulls. Brain size began to increase, not gradually over tens of millions of years as before, but in noticeable evolutionary steps. This was the beginning of the genus Homo. The earliest members of this lineage, often grouped under the name Homo habilis, lived in East Africa around 2.4 to 1.8 million years ago. They did not look dramatically different from Australopithecines at a glance, but their brains told another story. Averaging around 600 cubic centimeters, their brains were significantly larger than those of their predecessors. More importantly, the organization of those brains was changing. Regions involved in planning, hand-eye coordination, and complex motor control were expanding. This cognitive shift is inseparable from the archaeological record that appears alongside them. For the first time, stone tools became a consistent, central feature of survival. The older one tools associated with early Homo were simple, but simplicity should not be mistaken for primitiveness. Producing even the most basic flake requires foresight. The toolmaker must select appropriate stone, understand how it will fracture, and strike it at the correct angle with controlled force. This is not accidental behavior. It reflects a mind capable of anticipating outcomes before they exist. Tools also imply teaching. Techniques must be passed on. Knowledge must persist beyond individual lifespans. Culture, in its earliest form, had arrived. Africa's environments continued to reinforce this trajectory. Food resources were patchy and unpredictable. Large herbivores roamed grasslands, leaving behind carcasses that could be scavenged. With sharp stone tools, early Homo could access high-calorie marrow and meat that other predators could not easily reach. This dietary shift mattered. Animal protein and fat are dense energy sources, and a growing brain demands energy. The relationship between diet and cognition tightened. Better tools allowed access to better food, which supported larger brains, which in turn enabled better tools. A feedback loop had begun. Around 1.9 million years ago, a new species appeared that embodied this loop more fully than any before it. Homo erectus. This species marks a profound transition. Its body proportions were essentially modern. Long legs, shorter arms, a narrow pelvis optimized for efficient walking and running over long distances. Homo erectus was no longer hedging between trees and ground. It was a fully terrestrial being, built for travel. Its brain, averaging around 900 cubic centimeters, was dramatically larger than that of Homo habilis, and its tools reflected this change. Acheulean hand axes, symmetrical and carefully shaped, appear across Africa at this time. These tools required planning several steps ahead, visualizing a finished form and working toward it. They were not just functional, they were standardized. This suggests shared mental templates, a deeper level of cultural transmission. Homo erectus also mastered fire. By at least 1.5 million years ago, evidence of controlled fire appears at multiple African sites. Fire transformed everything. It extended the day, provided warmth, repelled predators, and created social centers around which groups gathered. Most importantly, it allowed cooking. Cooking breaks down food, increasing the calories available and reducing the energy needed for digestion. This freed metabolic resources that could be diverted to the brain. Fire and cognition reinforced each other, just as tools and diet had before. Africa's role remained central during this phase. Homo erectus evolved here before spreading outward, and spread it did. Around 1.8 million years ago, groups of Homo erectus began leaving Africa, moving into the Middle East, the Caucasus, Asia, and eventually Southeast Asia. This was not a sudden global conquest. It was a gradual expansion following ecological corridors, exploiting new habitats with a toolkit refined on African landscapes. That expansion is revealing. Homo erectus could leave Africa because Africa had prepared it. The continent's environmental variability had selected for endurance, flexibility, and innovation. Outside Africa, Homo erectus survived for over 1 million years, adapting to forests, grasslands, and temperate climates. Yet even as it spread, Africa remained the engine of evolutionary change. Back on the continent, populations continued to adapt and diversify. Around 700,000 to 600,000 years ago, another transition occurred. Homo heidelbergensis emerged, likely in Africa, carrying even larger brains and more sophisticated behaviors. This species represents a branching point. Populations that moved into Europe would eventually become Neanderthals. Populations that remained in Africa would continue along a different path, one leading to Homo sapiens. Once again, Africa functioned as a reservoir. Its size and diversity allowed multiple populations to persist, interact, and innovate. Climatic fluctuations during this period repeatedly fragmented habitats, isolating groups, and then reconnecting them. Each cycle promoted experimentation and the spread of successful traits. Tools became more refined. Hunting strategies became more cooperative. Communication grew more complex. The African record shows a pattern that repeats across deep time. Change does not eliminate diversity, it generates it. And diversity, in turn, fuels resilience. While Eurasian populations of hominins often faced bottlenecks and isolation, African populations remained larger and more interconnected. This difference would matter profoundly in the next stage of the story. By the time Homo sapiens emerged, the groundwork had been laid by millions of years of African evolution: upright bodies, free hands, tool-dependent survival, fire-centered social life, growing brains shaped by cooperation and learning. None of these appeared in isolation. They were the cumulative outcome of Africa's unique capacity to sustain long-term evolutionary experimentation. In the next part, we will follow the final emergence of our species and explore how Africa not only gave rise to Homo sapiens, but shaped the cultural and cognitive traits that allowed us to eventually leave the continent and transform the world. By around 300,000 years ago, the long African experiment reached a threshold. The bodies were ready, the brains were large, the tools were refined, fire was controlled, social life was complex, but something deeper was still forming, something that would distinguish Homo sapiens not just from other animals, but from every other human species that had ever existed. This phase is not defined by a single fossil or a single invention. It is defined by a shift in how information moved through groups, how ideas accumulated, and how minds connected. This is the emergence of fully modern humans in Africa. The fossil record tells us that the earliest Homo sapiens appeared across multiple regions of the continent, not in one isolated birthplace. Fossils from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, dated to roughly 315,000 years ago, show unmistakably modern faces paired with slightly elongated brain cases. In East Africa, remains from the Omo River region in Ethiopia confirm the presence of anatomically modern humans by at least 195,000 years ago. Southern Africa adds its own evidence through sites that preserve early sapiens' behavior and technology. This geographic spread matters. It tells us that Homo sapiens did not arise from a single small population that suddenly transformed. Instead, our species emerged from a network of interconnected African populations exchanging genes, behaviors, and innovations over long periods of time. This is what scientists now call the Pan-African origin model. Africa's size made this possible. Vast distances separated groups, but climatic cycles repeatedly connected them. During wetter periods, grasslands expanded, rivers flowed, and migration corridors opened. During drier periods, populations retreated into refuges, pockets of survivable habitat surrounded by harsher conditions. These cycles of isolation and reconnection acted like an evolutionary engine. Isolated groups developed local adaptations and innovations. When conditions improved and groups met again, the most successful ideas spread. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this process shaped a species that was both diverse and unified. The physical traits of Homo sapiens reflect this history. Compared to earlier hominins, sapiens had lighter, more gracile skeletons. The skull became high and rounded, with a vertical forehead and a reduced brow ridge. A chin appeared, a small feature with no obvious mechanical advantage, but a reliable marker of our species. These changes are subtle, but together they reflect a reorganization of the brain. It is not that sapiens suddenly had much larger brains than Neanderthals or earlier humans. It is that the internal wiring supported new kinds of thinking. Planning over longer timescales, managing larger social networks, creating and interpreting symbols. The archaeological record begins to show these changes clearly. In Africa, stone tool technology shifted toward prepared core techniques. Toolmakers shaped a stone core in advance, visualizing the final flake before it was struck. This required abstract reasoning and mental simulation. At the same time, tools diversified. Points, scrapers, blades, and composite tools appear. Some were likely hafted onto wooden shafts, creating spears, or cutting implements with greater efficiency. This level of complexity implies teaching, shared norms, and accumulated knowledge. But the most striking evidence of modern minds appears in behavior that has no immediate survival payoff. At sites like Blombos Cave in South Africa, dated to around 100,000 years ago, archaeologists discovered engraved pieces of ochre with deliberate geometric patterns. These markings are not functional. They are symbolic. They show that humans were creating meaning beyond utility. The same sites yield shell beads, pierced and worn as ornaments. Jewelry signals identity. It communicates group membership, status, or belief. It only works if others share the symbolic language. This is culture in a deep sense. It requires shared understanding across minds. It requires language, or something very close to it. Language does not fossilize, but its fingerprints are everywhere in the archaeological record. Coordinated hunting, long-distance exchange of materials, standardized tool traditions, and symbolic artifacts all point to complex communication. Africa provided the social conditions for this to flourish. Larger interconnected populations meant ideas did not disappear with individuals. Knowledge could accumulate across generations. Stories could be told, skills refined, mistakes corrected. This cumulative culture is what truly sets Homo sapiens apart. It allowed adaptation to outpace genetic change. Solutions could be shared faster than natural selection alone would allow. And once this system was in place, humanity became extraordinarily resilient. For tens of thousands of years, Homo sapiens remained in Africa, refining this cognitive and cultural toolkit. This long incubation period is crucial. When sapiens finally left Africa, they did not do so as fragile newcomers. They left as a species already shaped by environmental volatility, social complexity, and constant innovation. Africa had not just produced modern humans, it had trained them. The continent's fluctuating climates ensured that no single way of life became permanent. Populations that clung too rigidly to one strategy failed. Those that adapted survived. This pressure selected for minds that could imagine alternatives, plan for uncertainty, and cooperate flexibly. By the time sapiens expanded beyond Africa, these traits were deeply embedded. In the next part, we will follow that expansion, the great migration that carried African-born humans across the globe, and examine why Homo sapiens succeeded in environments where other human species eventually disappeared. By around 70,000 years ago, something changed. Homo sapiens, after spending more than 200,000 years evolving within Africa, began to move beyond the continent in sustained numbers. This was not the first time humans had left Africa. Earlier species like Homo erectus had done so long before. But this migration was different. It was not just a geographical expansion. It was the spread of a new kind of adaptability, one rooted in culture, communication, and collective intelligence, rather than purely physical traits. The groups that left Africa at this time were small. Genetic evidence suggests that all non-African humans today descend from a population numbering perhaps only a few thousand individuals. This bottleneck is visible in our DNA. Genetic diversity decreases the farther populations are from Africa, reflecting a series of founder events as people moved into new regions. Yet this small group carried something far more powerful than numbers. They carried a cultural toolkit refined through tens of thousands of years of African life. When these early sapiens crossed into the Middle East, they entered landscapes already occupied by other human species. In the Levant and Europe, Neanderthals had lived for hundreds of thousands of years. They were skilled hunters, masters of fire, adapted to cold climates with stocky bodies and large brains. In Asia, other archaic humans, including Denisovans, occupied vast territories. The world was not empty. Homo sapiens did not step into a vacant stage. They stepped into a complex human ecosystem. What followed was not a simple story of replacement. It was a period of overlap, interaction, and interbreeding. Genetic studies show that modern non-African humans carry Neanderthal DNA, and some populations carry Denisovan DNA as well. These encounters were intimate enough to leave lasting genetic traces. But despite this mixing, Homo sapiens eventually became the only surviving human species. Understanding why requires looking beyond strength or intelligence in isolation. Neanderthals were strong. Their brains were comparable in size to ours. Denisovans were adapted to extreme environments. What sapiens had was scale and connectivity. African evolution had favored large, interconnected populations capable of rapid cultural exchange. When sapiens entered Eurasia, they brought this advantage with them. Ideas spread quickly within groups and between groups. Tool innovations did not remain local. Hunting strategies, clothing techniques, and social norms could be shared and refined. Language allowed detailed planning and teaching. Symbolic culture fostered strong group identities that supported cooperation among large numbers of individuals. These factors created a cumulative advantage. Small improvements added up quickly. When environments shifted, sapiens could adjust their behavior without waiting for genetic change. Neanderthal populations, by contrast, were smaller and more isolated. Europe during Ice Age cycles fragmented habitats into refuges separated by ice and tundra. Populations were often cut off from one another for long periods. Innovation still occurred, but it spread more slowly. When conditions deteriorated, there were fewer backup populations to draw from. Over time, this difference mattered. Homo sapiens expanded rapidly. Within a few tens of thousands of years, they reached Southeast Asia and Australia, a journey that required planning, seafaring, and social coordination. By around 40,000 years ago, they had entered Europe in large numbers. By at least 15,000 years ago, they had crossed into the Americas. In evolutionary terms, this spread was astonishingly fast. A species that had spent most of its existence confined to Africa suddenly occupied nearly every habitable environment on the planet. Throughout this expansion, the African legacy remained visible. Tools adapted to local conditions, but the underlying capacity for innovation remained constant. Art appeared in caves. Burials became more elaborate. Long-distance trade networks emerged. These behaviors were not invented anew in each region. They were expressions of a cognitive system forged in Africa. Even as sapiens absorbed genes from Neanderthals and Denisovans, the core of the species remained African in origin. The vast majority of human genetic diversity still resides in Africa today. This fact underscores a central truth. Africa was not just the birthplace of our species. It was the training ground that equipped us to survive anywhere. The migration out of Africa did not mark the end of African influence. It marked its global expression. Every human society that followed carried with it the imprint of African evolution. In the final part, we will step back and reflect on what this deep history means for how we understand ourselves today, as one species with a shared origin, still adapting, still changing, and still shaped by the continent that made us human. As Homo sapiens spread across the world, something subtle but profound became clear. Our success was not driven by sharper claws, thicker fur, or stronger muscles. It was driven by something far less visible but far more powerful: our ability to live inside shared ideas. By the time humans reached Europe, Asia, and eventually the far edges of the continents, they were no longer just adapting biologically to their environments. They were adapting culturally, and doing so at a speed evolution had never seen before. This shift marks a turning point in the human story, one where culture began to outpace biology as the primary engine of survival. In Africa, this process had been building slowly for hundreds of thousands of years. Outside Africa, it accelerated dramatically. Language became more complex and expressive. Stories, myths, and shared beliefs allowed groups to coordinate actions far beyond what face-to-face interaction alone could support. A group could cooperate not just because its members were related, but because they believed in the same rules, the same symbols, the same imagined social realities. This ability to cooperate flexibly at scale is one of the defining features of Homo sapiens, and it has deep African roots. Archaeological evidence from the period after sapiens left Africa shows an explosion of symbolic behavior. Cave paintings in Europe, carvings in Asia, ritual burials, musical instruments, body adornment. These were not isolated curiosities. They were expressions of a cognitive system already in place, one capable of abstract thought, emotional expression, and shared meaning. Importantly, these behaviors appear rapidly after sapiens arrive in new regions, suggesting they were not inventions forced by new environments, but traits carried with them from Africa. Culture was portable. It traveled with people, adapting to local conditions without losing its core structure. This portability explains why Homo sapiens could thrive in environments that would have destroyed other hominins. In Ice Age Europe, humans developed tailored clothing, complex shelters, and seasonal migration patterns. In deserts, they learned to exploit sparse resources and navigate vast landscapes. In rainforests, They adapted hunting and gathering strategies to dense, closed environments. None of this required new genes. It required new ideas, and ideas spread faster than mutations ever could. This is where Africa's long role as a crucible becomes even more important. African populations had already endured repeated cycles of isolation and reconnection driven by climate change. These cycles trained sapiens to preserve knowledge, transmit it reliably, and modify it when conditions changed. In other words, Africa selected not just for intelligence, but for learning how to learn together. Other human species had culture, but it appears to have been more fragile, more localized. When Neanderthal groups disappeared, their cultural traditions often vanished with them. In sapiens, culture became cumulative. Innovations stacked on top of one another instead of being lost. This cumulative culture is the hidden engine behind humanity's dominance. It is also why population size matters so much. Larger interconnected populations preserve more ideas. Africa's vast and diverse human networks gave sapiens a deep reservoir of cultural variation before they ever left the continent. When small groups migrated outward, they carried compressed versions of that reservoir with them, enough to adapt quickly, enough to survive. Over time, this cultural flexibility reshaped the planet. Humans altered ecosystems, hunted large animals to extinction in some regions, reshaped landscapes through fire and later agriculture. These actions were not coordinated by instinct. They were driven by shared plans, beliefs, and goals. The same cognitive traits that allowed cooperation and creativity also gave humanity unprecedented power. Power, however, is neutral. It amplifies intent. As sapiens spread, they did not always coexist gently with other species, human or non-human. Neanderthals and Denisovans gradually disappeared. Large mammals vanished from many continents. The success of Homo sapiens came with consequences. This too is part of our evolutionary inheritance. Africa shaped not only our strengths, but our responsibilities. By the end of this phase, humanity had become something entirely new in Earth's history. A species capable of shaping its own environment faster than the environment could shape it in return. Evolution had not stopped, but it had changed pace and direction. The next chapter of the story would no longer be written only in bones and genes, but in choices, technologies, and collective actions. In the final sections, we will step back from the timeline and reflect on what this African origin means for how we understand ourselves today, our divisions, our shared humanity, and the future path of a species born in one place, but belonging to the entire planet. As we step back from the long arc of migration and expansion, it becomes clear that the deepest legacy of Africa is not just where we came from, but how we became the kind of beings we are. By the time Homo sapiens had spread across the globe, the defining features of our species were no longer primarily anatomical. Our skeletons changed only slightly after leaving Africa. Our brains did not suddenly double in size. Instead, what truly defined us was an internal shift, a way of thinking and relating to one another that transformed survival into something more than endurance. Africa did not simply produce humans. It produced a new mode of existence, one built on cooperation, shared meaning, and collective memory. This is where the concept of shared humanity begins to matter, not as philosophy, but as biology and history intertwined. From an evolutionary perspective, Homo sapiens is an unusually young species. 300,000 years is a brief moment compared to the millions of years that shaped earlier hominins. This youth explains something profound. The genetic differences between human populations are extraordinarily small. Two people from opposite ends of the planet are almost genetically identical when compared to the variation found within African populations themselves. This is not an abstract statistic. It is direct evidence that we are all descendants of a relatively recent African population that diversified only after spreading outward. The visible differences we associate with race, skin color, hair texture, facial features are shallow adaptations to local environments. They are controlled by a tiny fraction of our genome. Beneath them lies a shared blueprint forged in Africa under the same evolutionary pressures. Understanding this reframes human difference. Variation is not evidence of separation. It is evidence of adaptation layered on top of unity. Africa's role in shaping this unity is inseparable from its diversity. The continent that gave rise to Homo sapiens was never uniform. It contained rainforests, savannas, deserts, coastlines, mountains, and rift valleys. Human populations adapted locally while remaining connected through migration and gene flow. This balance between difference and connection is what allowed sapiens to thrive. It is also what allowed culture to flourish. Culture requires diversity of ideas and enough contact for those ideas to spread. Africa provided both. When humans left Africa, they carried this structure with them. Small groups moved into new lands, but they retained the capacity to build shared identities, create norms, and cooperate with strangers. This capacity is often described as the ability to live within imagined communities, groups held together not only by kinship, but by shared stories, symbols, and beliefs. This is one of the most powerful evolutionary innovations ever to arise. It allowed humans to coordinate in numbers far beyond what direct personal relationships could support. Nations, religions, trade networks, and eventually global civilizations are all extensions of this same cognitive ability. Its roots lie deep in Africa's social and ecological history. The long period during which Homo sapiens remained in Africa was essential for this development. For hundreds of thousands of years, populations faced recurring environmental instability. Droughts, floods, shifting rainfall patterns, and changing ecosystems forced people to rely on one another. Knowledge became a survival tool. Those who could learn from others, teach others, and integrate information across generations had an advantage. Over time, natural selection favored minds that were not just intelligent, but deeply social. Empathy, communication, and cooperation became as important as strength or speed. This is why language matters so much in the human story. Language allowed experiences to be shared rather than lost. It allowed planning beyond the present moment. It allowed memory to become collective. While other animals communicate, human language allows abstraction. We can talk about things that are not here, not now, or may never exist. This ability transformed evolution itself. Cultural solutions could spread faster than genetic ones. A new hunting strategy or tool design could be adopted by an entire group within a generation. Africa's interconnected populations provided the perfect environment for this process to take hold and stabilize. When Homo sapiens entered Eurasia, this system gave them an edge that was subtle but decisive. Neanderthals and other archaic humans were skilled, intelligent, and adapted to their environments. But their populations were smaller and more isolated. Cultural innovations did not spread as widely or persist as reliably. In Sapiens, culture became cumulative. Each generation inherited not just genes, but an expanding library of knowledge. This library allowed rapid adaptation to new climates, new prey, new challenges. It also allowed humans to reshape their environments rather than simply respond to them. This power came with consequences. As humans spread, ecosystems changed. Large animals disappeared in many regions shortly after human arrival. Landscapes were altered through fire and later agriculture. These changes were not driven by malice, but by success. A species capable of cooperation, planning, and innovation can also overwhelm systems that evolved without such a force. This raises an important point about the African legacy. Africa shaped humans to be adaptable, creative, and powerful. It did not shape them to be gentle by default. Our evolutionary success carries responsibility. The same traits that allowed us to survive ice ages and cross oceans now place us in a position to affect the entire planet. This is not a departure from our evolutionary story. It is its continuation. Today, humanity faces challenges that echo those of the past: climate change, environmental instability, resource scarcity. Once again, survival depends on cooperation, shared knowledge, and adaptability. The tools are different, but the underlying demands are the same. Our ancestors survived by pooling information, by maintaining diversity, by staying connected across regions. These strategies are written into our biology and history. They remain available to us. Africa's role in this story does not end in the past. It continues in the present. The continent remains one of the most genetically, linguistically, and culturally diverse places on Earth. This diversity is not accidental. It reflects deep evolutionary patterns. Africa has always been a place where multiple ways of being human coexist. This diversity is a strength, just as it was in the past. Recognizing Africa not only as the origin of humanity, but as a living source of innovation and resilience changes how we understand the world. As this section comes to a close, one idea should remain clear. The story of human evolution is not a story of division. It is a story of connection. Every human alive today is separated from every other by only a few thousand generations. In evolutionary terms, that is nothing. We are a single young species with a shared origin and a shared future. Africa is where that story began, not as a myth or a symbol, but as a real place with real landscapes that shaped real bodies and minds. In the final part, we will reflect on what it means to carry this legacy forward, and how understanding our African origin can reshape the way we see ourselves, each other, and the path ahead. As we move toward the end of this long journey through deep time, it becomes important to sit with the implications of everything we have uncovered. Human evolution is often presented as a ladder, a series of steps climbing steadily upward towards some imagined pinnacle. But what Africa shows us is something very different. Our story is not a straight line. It is a web, a network of branching paths, dead ends, convergences, and second chances. And at the center of that web sits Africa, not as a single origin point frozen in time, but as a dynamic, living system that continually shaped and reshaped what it meant to be human. One of the most striking lessons from this history is how contingent our existence really is. There was nothing inevitable about Homo sapiens. At many points along the way, our lineage could have vanished, just as so many others did. Early primates survived the asteroid impact by chance and adaptability. African apes survived climate shifts that wiped out their relatives elsewhere. Early hominins endured droughts, volcanic eruptions, and ecological upheavals that could easily have ended the experiment. Even within Homo sapiens, genetic evidence shows population bottlenecks so severe that our species may have come close to extinction more than once. The fact that we are here at all is the result of resilience layered on top of luck, repeated over millions of years. Africa's role in this survival was not passive. Its size mattered. Its diversity mattered. When one region became uninhabitable, another could serve as refuge. When populations shrank in one area, others persisted elsewhere. This spatial insurance allowed humanity to weather crises that would have wiped out smaller, more isolated species. It also allowed different solutions to the same problems to emerge simultaneously. Some groups focused on coastal resources, others specialized in savanna hunting, others adapted to forests or highlands. Over time, these different strategies fed back into the broader human story through migration and interbreeding. Diversity was not noise in the system, it was the system. This has profound implications for how we think about progress. Modern narratives often assume that technological advancement is the primary marker of success. But for most of our history, survival depended on social bonds, shared knowledge, and flexibility rather than constant innovation. Many human populations lived sustainably for tens of thousands of years without agriculture, cities, or metal tools. Their success lay in deep understanding of local environments and strong social networks. These traits, too, were shaped in Africa. They remind us that being human is not just about changing the world, but about fitting into it intelligently. Another lesson concerns time. Our species is young, but our behaviors are ancient. The instincts that shape our lives today, cooperation, fear of exclusion, attachment to group identity, sensitivity to status, evolved in small African communities where social cohesion meant survival. These instincts served us well in that context. But in a world of billions, they can also create conflict and division. Understanding their evolutionary roots does not excuse harmful behavior, but it does help explain it. It gives us the opportunity to design societies that work with our nature rather than against it. In this sense, evolutionary history is not just about the past, it is a tool for navigating the present. Africa also forces us to confront misconceptions about human difference. For centuries, distorted ideas about race have been used to justify inequality and violence. Evolutionary biology dismantles these ideas completely. There is no biological hierarchy among human populations. There is no deep genetic separation. All humans belong to a single branch that split only recently. The traits we use to categorize one another are adaptations to sunlight, climate, and diet, not markers of separate origins. Africa's deep genetic diversity does not divide humanity. It unites it by revealing how closely related we all are. When we look at a map of human genetic variation, it does not form neat boundaries. It forms gradients, flows, and overlaps. This mirrors our evolutionary past. People have always moved, mixed, and shared. Borders are recent inventions. Migration is ancient. Africa was not only the starting point of this movement, but its first great crossroads. Seeing ourselves through this lens can change how we relate to one another. It replaces myths of separation with evidence of kinship. It reframes diversity as a shared inheritance rather than a source of fear. As we reflect on Africa's role, it is also worth acknowledging that much of what we know comes from the work of countless scientists, many of whom spent years excavating fossils in harsh conditions, analyzing fragments of bone and stone, and piecing together stories from incomplete evidence. Our understanding continues to evolve. New discoveries may shift timelines or reveal unexpected branches, but the core pattern remains robust. All evidence converges on Africa as the primary stage of human evolution. This convergence is one of the strongest in all of science. Fossils, genetics, archaeology, and climatology all tell the same story from different angles. Looking forward, the question becomes not where we came from, but what we do with that knowledge. Evolution has equipped us with remarkable abilities, but it has not given us instructions. The future of our species depends on choices, not genes. Climate change, technological power, and global interconnection present challenges unlike any faced by our ancestors. Yet the strategies that once ensured survival remain relevant. Cooperation across groups, respect for diversity, willingness to adapt, recognition that no population thrives alone. These are not modern inventions, they are ancient African lessons. As this part draws to a close, it may help to pause and imagine the sheer continuity of the human story. From early primates clinging to branches in post-asteroid forests, to bipedal apes walking across volcanic ash, to modern humans contemplating their origins under electric light, the thread has never broken. You are part of that thread, not as an observer, but as a continuation. Your existence is the result of countless successful adaptations, each one rooted in environments that shaped minds capable of learning, remembering, and sharing. Africa is not just behind us, it is within us, in patterns of thought, in social instincts, in the very structure of our bodies. In the final section, we will bring this journey to rest by reflecting on what it means to carry such a deep and shared origin, and how recognizing ourselves as one young species can shape the way we move forward together. As this journey comes to a close, the question that guided us from the beginning finally settles into focus. Why did humans evolve only in Africa? After tracing millions of years of change, survival, and adaptation, the answer is no longer a single sentence, but a quiet understanding. Africa was not chosen. It was not destined. It simply became the place where all the necessary forces came together at the right time, and where they were allowed to keep working without interruption. Geology fractured the land and created diversity. Climate shifted often enough to demand flexibility, but not so harshly as to erase life altogether. Space and scale allowed populations to separate, experiment, fail, reconnect, and share what worked. Over time, this combination shaped a species that could adapt not by changing its body alone, but by changing its behavior, its thinking, and its relationships. Africa did not give us certainty, it gave us resilience. And resilience, more than strength or intelligence, is what carried us forward, from the earliest primates sheltering in trees after the age of dinosaurs ended, to the first ape standing upright in a changing landscape, to Homo sapiens learning to speak, imagine, and cooperate. Every step of the human story unfolded within African environments that rewarded adaptability over specialization. Other continents produced remarkable life, but only Africa maintained the balance of pressure and refuge long enough for this particular experiment to continue. That experiment became us. When Homo sapiens finally left Africa, they carried far more than tools or fire. They carried ways of thinking shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of shared survival. They carried language, culture, memory, and the ability to learn from one another across generations. These invisible tools allowed humans to spread across the planet in a geological instant. Yet no matter how far we traveled, we never truly left Africa behind. Its influence remains written into our DNA, our bodies, and our minds. The scientific evidence is clear and unambiguous. All living humans descend from African populations. The genetic differences between us are small, recent, and superficial. Beneath them lies a shared origin so close in time that it places every person alive today within the same extended family. This is not poetry, it is biology. Africa is not one chapter in our story. It is the foundation of every chapter that followed. Recognizing this does not erase cultural differences or histories. Instead, it gives them context. Diversity is not a contradiction to unity. It is its natural expression. Africa taught our species how to survive through variation, connection, and cooperation. Those lessons remain relevant now, perhaps more than ever. We live in a world shaped by our own success, facing challenges created by the same intelligence and adaptability that once ensured our survival. Climate change, environmental strain, and global interdependence echo the pressures our ancestors faced on a smaller scale. The difference is that today, the entire planet is our shared landscape. The strategies that once carried small groups through drought and uncertainty, cooperation, shared knowledge, respect for diversity, are the same strategies that can guide us forward. As you rest with this story, imagine the long chain of ancestors stretching back through time. Each one lived just long enough to pass something forward. A body that stood upright, hands that learned to shape stone, a mind that could remember, imagine, and share. You are the continuation of that chain. Every breath you take is made possible by choices and adaptations forged in African landscapes long before memory or writing existed. In this sense, Africa is not distant. It is present in every step you take, every thought you form, every word you speak. The story of human evolution is often told as a story of progress, but perhaps it is better understood as a story of connection. Across time, across space, across all the variations of what it means to be human. We did not become human alone. We became human together, in one place, under shared pressures, shaped by the same earth and sky. That place was Africa, and no matter how far we wander, that origin binds us. As the night grows quiet, let that thought settle gently. You are not separate from this story. You are living within it. A brief, conscious moment in a journey that began millions of years ago and continues still. Rest now, knowing that beneath all the differences of the modern world lies a simple truth written deep in our history. We are one species, with one origin, shaped by one continent that made us human.